This happened when I was a teenager, over a decade ago. Despite taking place so long ago, it's something I still think about from time to time. Every time I do, it's never failed to bring up old, dreadful memories. It took place in North Dakota during one summer break. My friend Susie and I were young, fearless, and bored, a bad combination of things that led us to make some pretty reckless choices. The main one being our fascination with trespassing into old abandoned buildings and drinking whatever alcohol Susie managed to get a hold of. On this occasion, Susie was eager to check out the old church on the edge of town. It had been boarded up for years, but it was recently sold, and the rumors around town said that some rich businessman was going to convert it into some modern dream home for himself. We rode our bikes up there. The church itself was on a lone road, surrounded by an overgrown, weed-riddled courtyard. Even though it was boarded up, most of the planks of wood weren't secure, so it was easy for us to line a sweater on a broken section of the badly boarded stained glass window and crawl through it. The inside was a mess, with a thick layer of rubble covering the worn pews. A pile of hymn books were arranged in front of the pews, and there was an old dusty organ at the far side of the room, partially covered by a filthy sheet. It must have been years since this church had been properly used, and the whole place reeked of desolation and despair, which gave me the creeps. We sat on one of the pews, lit some candles, and started passing a bottle of liquor between us. Then we heard it. A loud screech from the organ keys. It caused us to jump in panic and stare over at the organ. We tried convincing each other it was a mouse or something, but Susie told me to go over there and check it out. I was terrified, but egged on by Susie, I squeezed past the pile of hymn books and over to the organ. The dirty sheet wasn't covering it anymore, and I couldn't see it anywhere. I shouted over to Susie that the sheet had vanished, and she laughed and accused me of trying to scare her. I got this horrible feeling I was being watched, and I just wanted to get out of there. So I walked away from the organ and towards Susie, stepping down onto a pew and walking along it to get there quicker. As I walked, I heard this strange tapping sound coming from below me. I looked down and saw him in the flickering light. A shadowy man huddled on the floor on an old prayer cushion, tapping his fingers against the back of the pew. When he saw me looking at him, he stared eerily at me and pressed his finger to his lips. The look in that man's eyes, it was void of any life, soulless. I knew instantly he was not someone to be around. I ran along the pew, frantically waved over at Susie, and then darted through the gap in the broken window and stayed out of there and anxiously waited for her. She took ages to appear, and I started to think that the man had gotten her. Then I heard it from outside, the untuned sounds of the organ being played. I was only a kid at the time, so I was too afraid to go back in there to find my friend. The longer it took her to return, the more filled with dread I became. When she finally crawled out of the window, I was so relieved, but she had this vacant look in her eyes, and I noticed these bumpy red scratches on her face that hadn't been there previously. They were like nothing I'd ever seen before. The whole left side of her face was swollen, but when I mentioned them, she didn't say a word to me and just got on her bike and rode home. We spoke once after that, a day or two later, and she denied anything ever happening. There was a quiver in her voice, and to this day, I'm convinced something else happened in there. Something involving that creepy man and the strange lumpy scratches on her face. A few months later, the building work started on the church, and now it's been converted into a house. I don't know who that man in the church was, why he was hiding in there, but I do regret leaving my friend in there. It'll always haunt me as much as it will always be a mystery, one that will forever remain lost in the foundations of that church. My grandparents lived in a farmhouse in a rural small town. I used to go and visit them as a child, mainly during the holidays. Admittedly, I didn't like visiting them and used to beg my parents to let me stay at home. They were kind enough people, but they were very religious and set in their ways. They never really took me anywhere exciting, gave me a long list of chores to do around the farm, and made me attend church nestled between two of the towns with them for Sunday Mass. I hated how the sermons used to drone on for what felt like hours. The stuffy smell of the old wood and the scrutinizing eyes of the other churchgoers who seemed to notice my every flinch, stretch, and yawn and made sure to give me disapproving looks about it. I was about 11 or 12 when my parents had to go on a business trip, so they drove me out to my grandparents' farmhouse. As soon as I arrived there, I noticed the for sale sign out front, and my grandparents seemed on edge. They told me not to go out beyond the farmhouse fence, and on that Sunday, I was dressed in my Sunday best, assuming we were headed to church. Both my grandparents gave me horrified looks, and my grandmother insisted I immediately go change. After that, whenever I tried asking them about the church, they'd clam up and get really defensive. Then later that day, before they left for the grocery store, they warned me again not to go beyond the farmhouse fences. Being a kid, and also annoyed at being told to do something without being given a reason, I waited until my grandparents left, snuck out of the farmhouse, and walked down the sycamore-lined road that led to the church. There were several vehicles in the parking lot, and I could hear chatter coming from within the church. I stayed outside for a while and listened. The longer I stayed there, the more I noticed the differences from the last time I'd been there with my grandparents. The welcome board where the sermon times were listed was gone. Only the holes in the ground where it had been remained. And there was something else. The cross that had been on top of the church bell tower wasn't there anymore. I crept around the church to see if it had fallen down into one of the surrounding bushes, but I couldn't find it anywhere. But I did find something. Hidden amidst a bush was a black plastic bag. My heart pounded like crazy in my chest as I forced myself to open it. I was terrified of what I was going to find in it. They were hymnals, about 50 of them in bad condition, all in the dark red coverings that I remembered singing from in church. When I looked up from the bag, I saw I wasn't alone. A woman in a long dress with brownish red stains was staring at me. She asked me if I was lost and told me to come with her, and then she pointed to the church. But something about this woman didn't feel right, so I told her I wasn't lost and I had to go now. But she continued staring at me with this intense look. Then she told me that I didn't have to be lost anymore and that I would have to go with her to save myself. Then she pointed again at the church building. I noticed how she never once used the word church, which, after thinking about it, added to the weirdness. The whole situation made me feel uncomfortable and I just wanted to get out of there. Then the church doors opened and I saw some people walk out. I could only see a side view of some of them, but the ones I did see were wearing light-colored clothes covered in brownish red stains. I looked at the woman, begging her with my eyes not to catch the attention of the others. She shook her head, and then in a peculiar, almost sing-songy voice, told me there was still time to follow her inside. As she turned to point at the church, I ran through the overgrowth of bushes and climbed the surrounding fence into the field. Before I ran off, I turned back and saw that woman surrounded by several other people, all in brownish stained clothes, all staring at me intently. I ran all the way back to the farmhouse and locked myself in the bedroom until I saw my grandparents' truck pull into the drive. I didn't tell my grandparents what happened since I didn't want to get in trouble, but I didn't dare leave the farmhouse again until my parents picked me up a few days later. My grandparents sold the farmhouse soon after that and moved. They're no longer with us. For the rest of their lives, they never mentioned that town, church, or farmhouse ever again, and I knew better than to ever mention them. They were never the same after they left that town. It was as though they had a dark secret within them that was eating them up. I'll never know for sure what happened to disturb my grandparents like that, but I'm convinced it involves that church where the two towns meet, and those strange people in the stained clothes. This story took place last summer. I'd been on a couple of dates with this girl who I'd met at a bar in my town. We'll call her Vita, and I was enjoying getting to know her. As we both came from religious families, the discussion often involved our faith. Vita told me about this church in the neighborhood she lived in growing up. She made it sound so idyllic with its white-paneled steeple and prominently placed yew tree. On our latest date in a diner, I was trying my best to impress her, so upon seeing how her eyes lit up on talking about this church, I suggested I drive us out there to see it. She was so excited by this and kept thanking and hugging me. Felt good knowing I was making her so happy. I guess I was also curious about visiting this church that meant so much to her. Before we left, she told me she needed to make a phone call and quickly went outside. I watched her through the diner window. She was pacing up and down the parking lot. She wasn't smiling anymore, and she was waving her arm around. I didn't know who she was talking to, but from what I could tell, she seemed to be having a heated conversation. I paid the bill and went out to meet her. I heard her still arguing on the phone, but upon spotting me, her attitude changed. She immediately ended the call and rushed over to me, again embracing me with her thanks and excitement. I didn't ask her about the phone call, but a nagging feeling in my gut was telling me something wasn't right about it. Knowing what I know now, I wish I'd listened to it, but at the time I didn't. Instead, I pushed aside my concerns and took the 2-hour-long drive out to that church. Vita was pretty quiet for most of the journey, speaking intermittently to gush about how excited she was. But when we reached the town, she didn't say much, just stared out the window vacantly. It seemed like your normal suburban town with the church at its center, similar to how Vita described it, but I don't know, it looked kind of run down. The walls were worn and faded, and some of the yew tree's branches seemed unevenly trimmed and somehow lopsided. I told Vita it looked great and got out of the car. She followed me, but all she managed was this forced smile. She folded her arms and looked unsettled. Then, as we reached the door of the church, she stopped walking and turned and looked at me with eyes full of fear. I asked her what was wrong, but she told me I shouldn't go inside the church, that he only needed one of us, and that if I went in there, I wouldn't come out. Before I could ask her what she meant, she pushed past me and went inside the church. I caught a glimpse of the inside before the door closed behind me. I swear I saw someone, a tall, shadowy figure standing in the aisle. This whole thing was creeping me out, and I didn't know what I was meant to do. I waited there for a few minutes and listened. I heard footsteps coming from within the church and muffled voices. Not wanting to just stand there and wait anymore, I pushed open the door and called Vita's name. Inside, it looked like a normal church with its rows of pews, hymnboard, and that familiar musky church smell. I couldn't see anyone there, so I walked around, taking in the church and hoping Vita was in one of the back rooms and would appear soon. With everything that had happened, things didn't feel right. The footsteps and voices I'd heard before were replaced with an eerie silence. I looked around and gathered that if Vita was still in the church, that she would have to be in one of the vestries or back rooms that the clergy used before the services. Then I heard a sound coming from one of those rooms. I approached it and pressed my ear to the door, but I couldn't hear anyone inside. I was about to sum up the courage to knock when I saw someone step out of the confession box and walk toward the middle of the aisle. It was the tall man. He was in the same spot he'd been standing in when Vita entered. He certainly wasn't a priest. I could tell based on his manner and scruffy clothing. I asked him if he could help me, and I told him I was looking for my friend. He stared at me with dark eyes and told me I must have been mistaken because no one else was here. The man was creeping me out, and I just wanted to leave. I walked along the aisle, and as I passed the man, I felt a coldness. I don't know what it was about that man, but he was giving off some seriously dark energy. I hurried past him, only looking back as I opened the door. He was still looking at me with this stone-cold stare. He told me to have a nice day now, and these words were enough to send shivers down my body. I rushed over to my car, locked myself in it, and tried to calm myself down. I phoned and messaged Vita, but she didn't answer or reply. I didn't want to leave her inside there with that man, but I didn't know what else to do. Then I saw the church door open. It was him again. He stood at the entrance and stared at me. It was only when he started walking toward me that I quickly reversed my car out of there and drove away. I saw him through the back window, just standing there, continuing to stare. I felt so terrible for leaving Vita that I called the police and told them I was concerned about my friend. They sent someone over to the church, but reported back to me that the man I must have seen was the caretaker there and a respected member of the community. He denied seeing Vita, and the police told me I must have been mistaken. I never heard from Vita again, and I have no idea what happened to her. Did she try luring me there as a trap and then change her mind? Was it the tall man she was arguing with on the phone? And were they the ominous he she was referring to? What would have happened if I'd gone into the church first? All I know is that look of pure fear was very real in Vita's eyes that day before she left me and stepped inside that church.